Hello.
Welcome to our 7th annual UW Cello Festival. We're so thrilled to have our special guest, Guy Johnston, here with us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And we're also very grateful to our sponsors, who I'm going to name now. The Wyoming Arts Council, the Dean's InReach, the Wyoming Music Department, Southwest Strings, Robertsons and Sons, Artino, Baronrider, Larson, Ovation Press, Playmore Cello, the Cheyenne Symphony Orchestra. So, please, if you are thinking of buying something, buy something from our sponsors. So without further ado, Guy Johnston.
Thank you, everybody. It's so nice to be here. And on such an auspicious day, not only is the coronation of our new King Charles III in England taking place, but it's also the Wyoming Cello Festival. And thank you, Beth, who's just left, for having me to be here and being part of the festivities. And here we are celebrating a cello king, David Popper, one of a number of cello kings, and I'll be referencing some of them along the way. And if you don't mind, I'm just going to stick to the script, because otherwise I might get too carried away. I was amused on my way here that, you know how you travel with your cello and people come up to you and say something. It was quite original. The last comment I got on my way here was, so, do you take this around with you for emotional support? And I said, actually, that's a really good one. So there we go. And I want to take this opportunity to share some of the insights and anecdotes I recently discovered about our dear Mr. Popper, from a book written by one of his last students, Stephen Deyer. Oh, we've moved on to another one. It was the previous. There we go. There it is. As well as to share some thoughts about the importance and relevance of Popper's cherished etudes that we all know and love, don't we? Yeah. Good. But first, who was David Popper? Popper was born in Prague in 1843. He studied with George Gultimer at the Prague Conservatoire and went on to have an illustrious career as a soloist, composer, chamber and orchestral musician before becoming a professor at the Liszt Academy of Music in Budapest. He was married to a distinguished pianist, Sophie Mentor, and they often toured together. Popper knew and worked with many of the acclaimed composers of the day, and was one of a leading group of cellists including Piatti, Davidoff, and Klengel. Casals sometimes referred to Popper as the old maestro. He was an innovator and helped to develop the foundations of cello playing that we know today through his much-loved pieces and etudes. Popper died in Baden, near Vienna, in 1913. So there's our Mr. Popper. Now we can move on. Thank you. So, like Mr. Popper, I'm sure all of you have heard of János Starker. Of course you have. Starker, another cello king from the past, was taught by one of Popper's students. I remember hearing Starker perform a couple of times and was amazed at his economy of motion, complexity of sound, and the athleticism in his playing, even at an older age. Cello playing is good for us. In the preface of Dayak's book, Starker writes, "A few years ago, a magazine called The Strad published a cellist's family tree. One of the branches had David Popper, followed by a pupil and successor of his, my teacher, Adolf Schiffer, and then myself. Ever since then, I am proud to be officially the instrumental grandson of David Popper, notwithstanding my love for my natural progenitors. No wonder then that after 25 years of absence from my native land, Hungary, my first visit led to the studio of David Popper in the Franz Liszt Academy. That is where I spent my childhood under the guidance of Schiffer. Seated under the portrait of Popper, it was still there, his face with a benign twinkle in the eye, listening and looking at hundreds of cellists, as if to say, you may not remember who I was or what I did, but you are playing the works I left for you. David Popper wrote many compositions, and today, until today, no one has better captured the essential elements in cello playing than he. It has often been said that one cannot truly master the cello without having learned Popper's high school of cello playing. True, no doubt, if one cares about what the cello and cellist can and should do. This book contains his life. It is timely. Cello playing is slowly nearing its zenith, and Popper's contributions in reaching this stage are immeasurable. We, the cellists, are forever grateful and indebted to him, and we're certainly grateful to Stephen Deac for bringing back the man to us. Let us take a moment to hear Starker performing some Popper, and you can find this on YouTube, and there's lots of delightful offerings. We might just go to the first one, actually. So, yeah.
This one? Sorry.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Giving you a little taster. One of the first things that struck my attention in this charming book was to learn that Popper actually held the cello like a viola da gamba with no end pin. Can you imagine playing the etudes with no end pin? Perhaps you should try it. It was only later, when Belgian cellist Adrien Francois surveyed, having got a bit too portly, according to some accounts, that the end pin came into existence to help support the cello. Popper worked with an amazing number of composers such as Berlioz, Wagner, Liszt and Brahms, to name but a few. Isn't it astonishing that he had all these connections with composers that we can only imagine what it must have been like to meet? Deac once asked Popper how Brahms rated as a pianist, having performed the F major sonata together. His reply was that there were quite a few inaccuracies, in spite of his great pianistic technique, adding, and he was loud too. You might be aware that one of Popper's etudes, number 19, was inspired by Wagner's Lohengrin. Popper wrote etudes to help facilitate passages in certain repertoire. Let's have a listen to the extract from the opera itself, and then we'll listen to a little bit of the etude so you can hear the relevance. Sounds pretty scrappy. I think that performance was actually a little bit, sorry Mr. Barenboim, but not very clear. But if they'd all practiced their Popper etude, maybe they would... Here comes the etude from the song. Okay. You get the idea. It's interesting to note that one of the most popular cello concertos during the latter part of the 19th century was by Robert Volkmann, and it was this concerto that Popper often toured with and made his name with. I'd like to play you a clip in case you haven't heard it before. It was only later that our cherished concertos like the Schumann and Dvorak and Saint-Saëns came into being. Who would have thought how our repertoire would evolve over the next century, inspired by notable cellists of each generation? And I'm curious to know what you think about this piece if you haven't heard it before. This is my friend Daniel Müller-Schott playing. heard this piece before? Yeah, a couple? Yeah, really go and have a listen to it. There's some really charming things in the piece, and very lyrical. You can hear it starts getting going a bit, and just imagining Popper in his own mind starting to think how he would write for the instrument. Yeah, it was really interesting to get to know this piece, having read the book. According to Derek, the very influential critic and editor, Brendel, had stated that Popper represented the modern artist. As he matured, he developed an individual style of his own, which was neither the robust and somewhat pedantic German manner of playing, nor the delicately light approach to bowing of the French school. Critics emphasized three characteristics which set him apart from his colleagues: elegant bowing, noble, refined style, and an extraordinarily sensuous tone, sometimes intriguingly intimate in quality. Derek observed that there was quite a degree of competition between Popper and his wife, Sophie Mentor. They were both brilliant performers, but in this area, one could also find contrasting speed, fervour and power. The massive piano repertoire greatly outweighs the somewhat limited number of solo works for the cello, and the percussive piano is capable of much greater dynamic impact than the lyric cello. They actually began to measure the length and volume of the applause, and rather than feeling pleasure for the other, would be distressed if it were greater than their own. Many of you will know of Popper's Hungarian Rhapsody. Who knows Popper's Hungarian Rhapsody? It's probably one of the more popular ones. And I'm curious to hear some of the. I thought you'd be curious to hear some of the amusing circumstances that went on around this work. Liszt, whose admiration towards his pupil, Sophie Mentor, was expressed in many ways, at one time gave her a manuscript of his newly composed Hungarian Rhapsody in order to keep it a secret from her husband, Popper. Sophie practiced and learned it away from home. On a joint recital in Vienna, she played, as an encore, a brilliant first performance of the new Rhapsody. The reaction of the audience was naturally overwhelmingly jubilant. In the wings, Popper measured the applause and noted the number of bows, and gradually grew suspicious that his wife had gone beyond the ordinary limits of fair competition by surprising the audience with this spectacular piece. I'm going to listen to a bit of it now.
I'm sorry, number?
We can start at the top, just there, that's good, yeah. We might skip through a bit so you can hear when it really gets going. Go to 5 minutes in, thereabouts. Okay, so, actually, you know, it's Liszt's fault that we all have to play from memory. Was it Liszt who started the tradition of playing by memory, or was it Paganini? Anyway, those guys in that generation have got a lot to answer for. But as Popper was a satirist and a wit of the first class, he thought now the means to make a strong musical retort. When it came his turn, after his own group of solos, to perform an encore, he announced that he would play an improvisation on the theme of the same rhapsody for cello alone. He played his version of the rhapsody in various transformations with embellishments and figurations, using all the fiery ornamentation, runs and double stops at his command, and building to a close which brought the house down. Let's have a listen to a performance I actually heard in person of Kian Sultani and Megumi Hashiba at the Wigmore Hall in London. Skip just a little bit into the middle, someone. Maybe a little bit further on, so yeah. Okay, well, you can make up your own minds which version you prefer, but we're all jealous, come on. Tension was brewing between them on the way home, and in the apartment, an argument exploded. Sophie completely lost her temper, endangering his safety by hurling at him anything she could grab, and screaming reproaches for his daring to challenge the success of her rhapsody. Popper carefully calculated his next move. He needed to stop his uncontrolled outburst of rage without harming her physically. He gently lifted one of the cats, she was very fond of her cats, walked to the open window and released it from the second story onto the sidewalk below. One hopes that this was not during the cat's life. The rather ruthless gesture, striking hard at Sophie's tender feelings for cats, shocked her into quiet. For a few days, there was peace in the house. It did not save the marriage. In 1880, Popper's published opuses had reached 60 in number, out of which about 30 of the most popular were regularly played by all concert cellists, and often on public demand. Let's have a listen to Feuermann, another cello king, performing his spinning song. You get the idea. Usually, the critics praised his beautiful and sensuous tone, his flawless technique, and his penetrating musicianship. However, I found this review by Hanslick quite entertaining to read, bearing in mind that cello was still only really just coming into fashion as a more soloistic instrument. There is certainly no music lover who does not like the cello. Therefore, how does it happen that as a concert instrument it so quickly becomes tiresome? Almost every cellist not only wants to display his beautiful cantilena in melodious passages, but also he particularly wants to exhibit his bravura technique, which, because of the nature of the instrument, is limited within a narrow range. In fast tempo, unmerciful jumps and slides are heard, and on the lower strings a rough rattle, and a childish, lisping violin-like playing in the higher register, where, particularly in the double stops, it seldom can be played in tune. In a later article, he said, "Excessive cello music makes me melancholy and annoyed." In 1881, contrary to this criticism, a critic from Berlin wrote, "Grützmacher, Kostmann and Popper are great names among cellists. All three are technically on the same level, but as far as the total effect of performance is concerned, Popper's playing is the most expressive. It is a happy circumstance that he is also a remarkable composer. More beautiful singing cantilenas we have seldom experienced from any other cellists." A year later in Madrid, Popper received more praise. Popper is an original and a notable artist who dominates his instrument as few can, and obtains from it extremely sweet sounds that astound the most knowledgeable of the art, not knowing which to admire more: the prodigiousness of the execution, the irreproachable refinement of his intonation, even in the most difficult passages, or the originality of the compositions which he executes, and in which are seen united his inspiration and talent. As is similar with Rubinstein on the piano, the meticulous could find at times unprecedented elements in his technique, but if one considers them as defects, one sees the imprint of genius, which imposes itself upon all rules, breaks barriers which for him are useless, and creates beauty above and beyond all precepts of technique. The Elfentanz and Russian Fantasy, among other works that we could mention, suffice to qualify Popper as a star of the first magnitude in the musical world. We can have a listen back to Starker again.
Sorry, 13?
Not that one. Elfentanz number 15.
15, right.
Yeah. You get the idea. Let's have a look at Popper's legacy through the eyes and ears of his students. Dare quotes the speech made at Popper's memorial in the Liszt Academy of Music in February 1914, and there it is, where there was a bronze plaque of Popper placed on the wall of his studio. We, the pupils of our deceased master David Popper, with deep emotion are gathered in this room so that in connection with the memorial concert which will take place tonight, we might express our debt to our unforgettable master and express our humble mourning. Here in this chamber during the last 5 years of his life, which he completely devoted to his pupils, and during which he was seldom heard by the public, in the role of the ideal teacher and educator, he guided his enthusiastic pupils with fatherly love in the art. Somehow his sunny presence consecrated this place, and the memory of his art and the precious demonstrations of his guidance filled our hearts with devotion. After each lesson, we felt that our lives had become richer and more noble and beautiful. Therefore, we, the last 7 of his pupils, in whom the memory of him lives most vividly, and the pain of the wound of sorrow throbs most hurtfully to him, wish to perpetuate his dear presence with this tablet. And I think that's the one there. Sooner or later, we will have to leave this place, full of beautiful memories. New student generations will follow, who will be able to visualize and gain some conception through the evidence of the stature of this immortal artist, composer, and teacher, the lovable and harmonious personality, in a Greek sense, Carlos Kagathos, the noble and heroically splendid man. In addition to his likeness by the sculptor Edouard Telx, let there also be in this room for future generations those few words of classic beauty by Arpad Sendi, which so faithfully express our feelings as follows. In this place, David Popper instilled in our souls love and enthusiasm for art, and wonderment for his personal greatness as an artist. The world, which he lifted through the magic of his genius, sensed him, but we to whom he revealed the treasures of his art with masterly hands understood his immortality. In our grateful hearts we cherish his memory. Deat goes on to recount a return visit to the Academy some years later in 1932. I spoke with some of my older colleagues, he says, about Popper as a teacher. They agreed with me in this same appraisal of his teaching objectives. He had 3 concerns: musical interpretation, articulate technique, and the conscious effort to produce tonal beauty. He expected from his students that they study the score and become familiar with all the parts, not only their own. Popper demanded a classical purity and strong rhythmic articulation. Perhaps we can explore some of these aspects which seem to connect in the class later today. Popper's colourful palette distinguished him from other virtuosos. Even back in 1863, a critic in Leipzig attacked Popper for his continuous vibrato, and an argument flared up in the press, pro and con its aesthetic value. Except on long cantilena tones, vibrato was not commonly used in those days, but Popper applied vibrato on short tones also, tempo permitting. Thus the expression continuous vibrato was invented, and the phenomenon objected to by so many critics. They did not realize the infinite variety of tone production and changing tone colour offered in this manner. During Popper's class, instructions and concerts, the same vibrato and tonal spark was still prevalent even in his late 60s. His technical principles, innovations and practical applications of the modern cello technique of the late 19th century were put down to his 40 etudes. In his classes, it was good form to play his etudes from memory, though he did not insist on it. Among those who wrote violoncello studies were few realized an ideal synthesis pleasing and interesting music of excellent form, which clearly projects a virtuoso technique. The 40 studies of Popper's are among the finest of such works. They provide a balanced fare of music and of technical innovation for the cellist. Many of the studies explore the technical problems which Popper had met in the music of his contemporaries, such as Wagner, Liszt, Berlioz, Schumann, Saint-Saëns, and Volkmann, as well as those he had introduced into his own concert pieces. Popper used fingerings designed to cope with the technical demands of the modern music of his time and fitting his artistic purposes. Today, the studies, because of their musical interest, inspire the student to develop a higher proficiency and to build a reserve of technical resources. Studies written for string instrument alone are necessarily constructed in monodic style, and usually based on short motives in sequential progressions. Unless the student can derive musical stimulus as well as technical training from the world, practicing could become boring and a mechanical experience. Popper succeeded admirably in his studies, placing the emphasis on the harmonic and rhythmic aspects of the horizontal structure with creative zeal, as it progresses through cadences and modulations, sometimes to distant keys. At the same time, the formal proportions and balance are maintained. Rhythmic piquancy is contrasted with strong rhythmic chords. In some of the studies, a lyric mood predominates. Deák goes on to say that Popper had mentioned some of his studies were inspired during his long train journeys on tour. For instance, in number 30, the rapid ascending and descending diatonic scales suggest the momentum of a train. Let's have a listen to Joshua. On. I'm sure you know this study. I found this next observation of Deák to be quite enlightening towards the end of Popper's life, as a new cello king was emerging. I'd like to take a moment to look at an extraordinary meeting point which brings us onto the great Catalonian cellist Pablo Casals. Stephen Deák describes a momentous moment when Popper first came into contact with Casals, which can't have been the easiest time to be nearing the end of your celebrated performing career and to accept the new innovations and stars emerging from the new flourishing generation. But that is what it's all about. And just looking at the time since Popper first came onto the scene to now, the cello has continued to rise in popularity, and the standards seem to continue to get higher and higher, as does the register of the playing. Having said this, and possibly a thought for another time, one might ask the question, is there the same uniqueness of sound from cellist to cellist? How has the recording industry and technology influenced our approach? In Popper's day, you had to go to concerts to hear the latest work and musician and hold on to the experience in your memory. Now we have everything available to us with a click of a button, and one can so easily be influenced by others that, but not always, one starts to copy and in turn starts sounding like another. By doing this, we miss the chance to connect with ourselves and our own unique voice. Yes, be inspired by others, but try not to copy. One of my past mentors, Bernard Greenhouse, who studied with Casals, told the story that he once copied all Casals' fingerings and bowings of the Bach suites during a summer festival. When he came to play it to the great man, Casals said, "Now you can erase all the markings." The takeaway here for Bernie was, why be a mediocre example of someone else's ideas? The lesson from Casals was to go in search of your own way. It also reminds me of a moment when a student was playing some Shostakovich for me. On asking why they were taking time in a certain place, they responded, "Well, Rostropovich does it, and I really like it." That's all very well, but why does he take time there? The student couldn't find an answer. This was another reminder to me in that moment that in an effort to get closer to the music, to be inside it, we need to understand the composer's intentions before coming to instinctive conclusions ourselves. Your experience of music making will be more profound when you come to these revelations yourself through a deeper understanding. But coming back to this meeting point of two cello kings, Deák says, in art, as well as in appearance, Casals was not the prototype of a 19th century romantic. He was short in stature, already balding in his 35th year, an austere, intensely concentrated aesthetic visage when on the stage. Eyes closed when he played, a solitary messenger of the great masters through their most intimate language. The new audiences of the 20th century instantly sensed the fresh musical experience, which was both a leap into the new century and a reinterpretation of the old. Casals brought a unique sound even to Popper's music, with which, by the way, the master was not in complete agreement. Casals was very well acquainted with all of Popper's works, and many, many years later, in 1960, he said to me, I played almost everything Popper wrote. In the fall of 1912, Popper suggested that I meet him at his house, and that we go together to hear Casals that evening. Since Mrs. Popper did not intend to go, he had an extra ticket. I felt privileged to take her seat and to escort my teacher to the concert. As I remember, the serenade and chanson villageois were on the programme, and Casals played the mazurka for one of his encores. We sat in the upper loge in relative privacy. During the concert, I watched Popper's reaction. His serious appraisal of the performance showed in the expression of his face, and he applauded after each number, but a slight puzzlement veiled the otherwise interested countenance. The striking difference between the prevailing bowing with loose wrist and straight thumb and Casals' bowing seemed most obvious when he played at the upper part of the bow without lowering his wrist, and compensated by the gradual pronation and elevation of his arm. But the upper arm position was radically altered when the bow was applied on the C string. It was drawn in close to the body, with wrists fairly straight. These observations were possible because our loge was located on the second floor of the concert hall, almost above the right side of the podium. Another first impression was Casals' limited use of slides. These were accepted by 19th century string players as the technical device for large leaps, as well as for intensely expressive effects, without regard for the distortion of musical playing. Casals had developed his unique style with an unconventional kind of fingering, which, among other things, employed frequent extensions. We were surprised and struck by his performance. His bowings and fingerings combined in the production of a flawless technical brilliance and a luminous tone, with infinite degrees of dynamic variation. Let's have a listen to a recording of Chanson, with Casals performing Popper's piece. We can even imagine that we were there listening with Mr. Popper. Sorry, that was Starker performing it, but you can imagine Casals. I actually had a look and I couldn't find them, but there's plenty of recordings of Casals. You can go away and listen to it. We should never forget these old masters. Following the concert, we did not attempt to go backstage to congratulate Casals. It was impossible to reach the artist's room because the entrance was blocked by hundreds of autograph seekers. I found out later that Popper and Casals had been involved in a discussion about gypsy music, probably in a restaurant or coffee house. We took the subway to his home and I was grateful for the noise, which prevented any conversation. However, in the pauses of station stops, Popper made some general comments, such as beautiful tone, excellent technique, fine musicianship, and splendid intonation. Then finally he said, in spite of all these, he did not touch my heart. With this remark, Popper indicated that the style of his own art was rooted in an earlier tradition, and that he felt uncomfortable when confronted with a new aesthetic language and a new cellistic technique. Deyac goes on to say, Popper faced the challenging problem that every artist, musician, painter, poet or writer experiences when the new generation comes forward with an innovative style. Popper's own playing had represented a move forward and away from the artists who preceded him. However, a link existed, a foothold from which to leap forward. But for him to be in full agreement now with the progressive trend would be a negation of lifelong convictions on which his art and his success has been built. At the present, there are movements which are drifting away from the type of performance which was new in the early 20th century. The profound revelation which I experienced when hearing Casals for the first time disturbed my loyalty to Popper, At that time, I was very confused. I was aware that I was witnessing a meeting of two giants of the cello, and I was quite overwhelmed both to my faith and admiration for my own teacher, Popper, and by the exciting and very convincing style of playing of the new musical sun on the horizon, Casals. I have the privilege of working with 16 students at Eastman School of Music. Whilst there are many great things going on, I'm occasionally bemused by some of the comments that students come up with. For instance, when I asked one student if they had played any of the Popper etudes, they responded, "Oh yeah, I played all those in high school." Well, I suppose one could misunderstand the title of the 40 etudes, which translates into English as High School of Cello Playing. High school in the US means something quite different from high school in Germany, which is in fact university and beyond. I reflected on some questions on my way here. Well, I'm curious to know how many of you play the Popper studies. How many of you have come, are getting to know them? Yeah, fantastic. So some of you are still, I know that there's some very young people here, so I'm not surprised. And he wrote some studies that came before these, you should have a look at before you get there. But as soon as you can and your teacher's ready to move forward on the etudes, I would really encourage it, especially the early ones. And take your time over them. Think about what you love about them and what you find challenging. And what is the point of practicing etudes? I reflected on these questions as I travelled here the other day. Popper was clearly a great cellist, and we are so lucky to have been left such a delightful array of his works. I think our aim with these etudes is to enable us to become more efficient, balanced and fluent in our relationship with ourselves and the cello. The beauty of Popper's etudes, that seems to mark them out from a lot of other studies, is their sense of storytelling and narrative in amongst the technical complexities. There is a natural quality to them, and with some patient, disciplined work, the notes are within our reach if we can just organise ourselves to be in the right place at the right time. Slow, patient practice is a key ingredient as we work to understand the purpose of each etude before building them up to perform either to our teacher, friends, audience, or just for ourselves. I think, along with the Bach suites, that these etudes should be part of our daily diet as cellists. The point of these etudes is not to play them like studies, drilling passages and in turn creating tension in our work, but to imagine them as character pieces, responding to their inner harmonic and melodic impulses and charm. Having said this, of course, there is a rite of passage and much work to be done, just like building the foundations of any home. As we search and become acquainted with each etude, it's a bit like getting to know a new friend. Why not imagine it like that? There's a certain mutual respect you have, which comes instinctively and evolves over time. And there's a lot to get to know about each other through shared experience. Or what about maintaining a garden? That requires a lot of effort if we are to enjoy it fully. How does it translate to etude work? There are many ways to explore each etude and building blocks that can help you with your long-term goals. For example, some working rituals and mindful technique work might include playing double stops when you have to cross strings, which will help to balance and structure the frame and elasticity of the left hand. Intonation work, isolating shifts, and even improvising around them, planning a bow stroke, trying different rhythms, and all the while coordinating your hands. We are learning to map the fingerboard and choreograph our play, and these etudes are rich with ideas, challenging us with different keys, tempos, bowings, fingerings, double stops, string crossings, dynamics, etc. But all of these aspects are in the service of the music and will of course feed into whatever repertoire we are playing. Working on them daily will help us to build up a stamina and concentration. We need to remember that technique is only a means to an end. Focusing on technical work helps us to create a logic that supports our expression, but we should never lose sight of the latter. Expression is the impulse for our technique and vice versa. One needs the other, just like any relationship. I think you'll agree that expression is a more inspiring and sustainable thought than thinking about technique. But of course, we need the technique to be able to communicate our thoughts, feelings, and undercurrents of the music. It is a constant balancing act and requires a lot of deep thinking and analysis. Please trust me, I'm really not trying to put you off. My aim is to motivate and inspire you to think creatively about your daily rituals, how they will benefit you long term, how to use your time, and it's worth remembering, perhaps a daily mantra, that being a musician and growing artist is a marathon, not a sprint. It is the search for answers that is so fascinating, not necessarily the answers themselves. Take your time, and over time, you will reap the musical rewards. If we can listen instinctively, not only being in the moment, but anticipating what is to come, our body has a chance to react in good time. Focusing your awareness on your posture, breathing, and playing from your core is something to keep coming back to in your practice. I was reminded recently that our skeletal structure carries our soul. We need to look after our form and ourselves. A healthy, natural, and positive approach to cello and music will give you the opportunity to enjoy the fruits of your labour as you sense the potential and endless possibility ahead of you. One of my great mentors, Stephen Isserlis, a living cello king, speaks about relaxing into your playing. I know this is easier said than done, because there is, of course, effort involved in playing the cello, maintaining a good posture, navigating around the fingerboard, bowing in and out of your torso, supporting gravity. Knowing a score and what you wish to communicate requires a certain mental and physical stamina, to say the least. But we can empower ourselves by creating good habits as often as possible, starting each new day with renewed vigour, enthusiasm, and sense of discovery. Sometimes it will feel like you're continuing on from the previous day, and other times it may feel that you're having to start all over again. Listen to what you need each day, and try not to fight yourself and your instrument. Take your time and open your awareness up to energized work for a better chance to grow and, as Stephen says, even relax. What problems and concerns do I notice with students working on these etudes? I think there can be a general attitude that one only needs an etude for a jury. In any case, it's likely the panel will only ask for a little bit of it. I'll be fine and can get by. My pieces are more important to me. Why not, instead of thinking this way, use these etudes as an opportunity to scrutinize our work more, be critical of ourselves without being negative, knowing that this investment will help to support our music making ahead and give us time to listen. Falling into the internal voice trap of saying something like, I'm finding this etude really hard and it's so frustrating, I sound terrible, isn't likely to get us very far, or as far as someone who has a more positive inner dialogue. I know this is currently not at the level I wish it to be at, but I'm going to work patiently, opening up new possibilities for growth, and trust that things will improve if I continue to work in a healthy and positive way. I'm aware there are a lot of distractions in life, but if you're serious about the cello and wish to develop to give you the best possible chance in your future professional life, consistency of practice is key, as is working to develop a positive and constructive mindset. One experience leads to the next, and of course there will be ups and downs, but our inner confidence evolves as we learn from the past and hone our skills around the cello for the future. We can learn a lot about ourselves with these etudes, so enjoy using them wisely from day to day, just like brushing your teeth. I had a lot of fun reading Stephen Derrick's memoir of David Popper during all that spare time we all suddenly had during the pandemic. It was one of a number of books I was thrilled to come across, and having more sense of the man behind the notes of this cellistic treasure, I believe it helps us to get even closer to Popper's holistic and ideological approach, and in turn influence each of our own unique cello voices in the 21st century. Have fun. Thank you. I was originally given an hour, and I've done that in 51 minutes. So, like, I know it's supposed to be 45. I don't know, Beth, probably there's no time for questions.
We could have some questions.
Because I know it's a very busy day.
It is a busy day.
Yeah? Any quick questions? Yes?
In teaching the proper etudes, do you try to approach them with your students in order, or do you tend to bounce around between different numbers?
That's a good question. Some like to go in order so they feel they're really making progress through the etudes, but others we try and find a study that, like Papa did himself, for the piece that they're playing. Try and find one that tackles some of the technical concerns you have in the piece that you're playing. And I think the point is that if you do that work in the first thing in the morning with your scales and you do your study work, then later when you come to the music, you're less distracted by the technique. You're sort of applying it. You have a chance to actually focus even more on the music. Of course, there's a building blocks to learning a piece of music, and you have to spend time understanding the ins and outs of it. But yeah, the point is that you're already getting yourself into good habits away from the piece itself, and then you can bring that into your piece. Yes.
So you said Popper made the cello more of like a solo instrument, and I heard Boccherini did the same. Do you think they like knew each other, or?
I think it was a bit earlier, Boccherini.
Okay.
But there's a connection. Everything connects. Boccherini wrote hundreds of cello quintets and was doing incredibly virtuosic things in a different country. That's the fascinating thing, is that all these cellists and all these composers were working in tandem in different countries at different periods and so on. And there's stories of Bach traveling 500 miles to go and hear his favorite organist, was it Buxtehude? Things like that. Would you think of going on a horse and cart, or walking 500 miles just to go and hear your favorite piece? Or it's an amazing thought, isn't it? Yeah. But I think I'm fascinated more and more by how all these greats of the past connect, and how we're all so influenced and inspired. If we can become inspired by them and what they did for us, we've got a lot to be thankful for. Yeah. Good. Thank you. Thank you.